Hey, everybody, welcome to the Daniel Davis Deep Dive Roadshow edition. I'm still at Brown University, where I'll be participating in a conference on a foreign policy issue later on. We'll talk about that another day. I just want you to know why we're not in our normal set. But listen, we're now one day away on May 9th from the Russian celebration of the victory of World War II. And we've been talking a lot about that. Foreign heads of state are coming, and there's a big threat of whether Ukraine is going to try to launch drones to try to disrupt it. You have different narratives on the victory, but one of the interesting things that we have that I'd like to discuss at first before we get into the main topic of the day, because it really kind of dovetails right into it, and that is who actually won World War II. Now, you may think that's an obvious answer. We did, naturally. But there's more to the story than that, especially it depends on who you ask what the actual truth was. And I'll be honest with you, a lot of Americans don't really understand the full scale of what our role was in and what the role were of some of our allies. And to try to make some sense out of that, we have Professor John Mearsheimer, international relations theorist, professor of political science at the University of Chicago, and somebody who teaches on this subject. And he's got some really interesting information I want to share with you. Not even information, it's just education to kind of bring us up together on what happened and why this matters. Now, before I even, open the door up here for you to talk about that, I want to set the stage. About 6 days ago, President Trump posted a Truth Social account where he says, many of our allies and friends are celebrating May 8th as Victory Day, which is today. But we did more than any other country by far and produced a victorious result in World War II. I am hereby renaming May 8th Victory Day for World War II, and November 11th is Victory Day for World War I, whatever. But we won both wars. Nobody was close to us in terms of strength, bravery, or military brilliance. But we never celebrate anything, which is odd to say. And so anyway, he goes on from there. But those are the big two things that we did more by far than any other country to win World War II. But what do you say, Professor?
Well, he's dead wrong on both World War I and World War II. I won't talk about World War I, but I will talk about World War II, where, of course, he's dead wrong. And also, I think he's showing great disrespect to Russia and to the former Soviet Union for the enormous price that they paid in defeating the Wehrmacht in World War II. Now, it's very important to understand that when we landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, this is about 11 months before the war ended. At that point in time, 93% of all German casualties were on the Eastern Front, 93%. And in those last 11 months of the war, roughly 2/3 of all German casualties were on the Eastern Front. To take it a step further, in 1942, during the famous Battle of El Alamein, where the British tangled with the German Wehrmacht, there were 4.5 German divisions, 4.5 in North Africa. At the same time, there were 190 German divisions on the Eastern Front. This is why the Russians, actually the Soviets, because it was the Soviet Union at the time, the Soviets lost, in my estimation, 24 million people. In the present Russian administration's estimation, they lost 27 million. The Americans lost a little over 400,000 men. And I do not want to belittle for 1 second the price that we paid and the British paid to defeat Germany, because we certainly contributed to that victory against Germany. But there's absolutely no question that it was the Soviet Union that paid the blood price. When you're in a war of attrition against a formidable adversary like Nazi Germany, and the only way you can win that war is to wear that Wehrmacht down, whoever does most of that heavy lifting is going to suffer enormously. And it was, of course, the Soviet Union or the Red Army that paid the blood price. Just think about that, 27 million people. In addition to the number of people that were killed, the amount of destruction that the Germans caused in the Soviet Union as they retreated eastward is almost unfathomable. They destroyed millions and millions of farms and towns and roads and so forth and so on. It's just truly remarkable how much destruction the Germans wrought on the former Soviet Union. So it's very important to understand that although the United States and Britain played an important role, they played an important role in defeating Nazi Germany. By far, the Soviet Union was the most important factor in finishing off the Third Reich.
And yeah, and I just want to reinforce that this is in no way any diminishing words upon the people who in the United States and Great Britain and some of the other Western allies who took part in this. As you yourself, you have family members who took part in that. Is that right?
Yeah, actually, my father was in the Army Air Corps, and my uncle, John J. Mearsheimer, who I was named after, was in the 10th Mountain Division in Italy. He was a combat medic, had 2 Bronze Stars with V's for valor. And I certainly would not want to diminish the importance of what the United States military did in contributing to the defeat of Nazi Germany. But again, there were other actors involved. And if you're weighing what was the relative contribution of each of the actors, there is absolutely no question that the Soviets paid that blood price. And by the way, in World War I, we suffered enormous casualties as well. But if you look at the casualty levels of France and Britain and Russia, which played the key role in defeating Imperial Germany, you cannot possibly make the argument that we, the United States, won World War I, that we paid the blood price of defeating Imperial Germany. We did pay a blood price. We did contribute. But the fact is that it was France, Russia, and Great Britain that paid the real blood price.
And what's the consequence of that? What's other than just like, well, all right, but I mean they were involved, but this is just kind of a hurrah moment for America. What is the real danger in having that kind of a view?
Well, I think the real danger is it just shows disrespect for other people. Number one, I think if you're in Russia today, which is, of course, the principal remnant state left over from when the Soviet Union collapsed, this is deeply offensive. Just think about the sacrifice that Russia / the Soviet Union played to defeat Nazi Germany. And here you have President Trump disrespecting that great sacrifice, disrespecting this country. But furthermore, when Trump makes comments like that, which are so at odds with the historical record, it really casts doubt or doubts on his judgment. It's truly remarkable that he would make such a foolish statement. Someone who is the president of the United States should simply know better. And I know that we've reached the point where we just say, well, this is Donald Trump, and he just says a lot of outrageous things. He contradicts himself from one day to another, and it really doesn't matter because it's just Donald Trump and everybody understands that. But I don't believe that's true. I think it says a lot about his judgment, and I think it says a lot about whether you can trust the man, because he's saying one thing one day and another thing another day, and much of what he says is simply not true. So if you're a foreign leader and you're looking at the United States and you're thinking about how to deal with Donald Trump, you have to scratch your head and say, is he a reliable negotiating partner? And I think the answer in most cases is no.
Okay, well, that's very significant because obviously we're in the process of trying to negotiate an end to this war right now, and because today is May the 8th, and many in the West are celebrating the end of the World War II today, and then Russia's going to celebrate it tomorrow. In Germany, for example, there was a celebration, celebrating the end of the war, and Russia and Belarus were expressly denied permission to even attend, even if they wanted to. They couldn't send diplomatic personnel. They rejected that. Meanwhile, Russia opened up. It says, yes, you're all welcome to come here. And of course, most of the West didn't. But Robert Fico, in particular, of Slovakia, made a point of saying, hey, listen, I went to the Arlington Cemetery and paid homage to the Americans. I went to UK to pay homage to the RAF pilots that helped liberate us. And I am going to Russia because they helped liberate us on the ground too. What does that tell you about at least some in Europe who seem to acknowledge the totality of the historical record?
Well, it tells you that this celebration is inextricably bound up with contemporary politics. In other words, it's almost impossible to deal with this important historical event called World War II without bringing the conflict in Ukraine into the discussion of that issue. And the reason that, President Trump and European leaders, except for people like Fico, won't go to Moscow is in large part because of the Ukraine war. And to some extent, you can understand that. But I think at the same time, dissing the Russians, treating them with great disrespect, and treating what happened between 1941 and 1945 with disrespect, as President Trump has done, is disgraceful and should not have happened.
And listen, I contend that it's more than merely disgraceful, because I think that these attitudes, and not just in the United States, but maybe even especially in parts of Europe, are being a major roadblock from bringing this war to an end and ending the pointless destruction of the Ukrainian people and territory. And really the best example of that is the most poignant one that's right on the top of my tongue is what happened yesterday in the European Union. You had Ursula von der Leyen make a speech. This is yesterday. This is not 5 months ago. This is not 2 years ago. This is yesterday. In light of everything that has happened here, in light of everything that President Trump is trying to do with Steve Witkoff, with Secretary of State Rubio, et cetera, to try and the direct phone calls with Putin to try to bring this to as rapidly of an end as we can, Ursula von der Leyen goes out to try to lay out the European view. Here in the first soundbite we have here, she acknowledges, first of all, yes, the war is going to end, but
the war in Ukraine will eventually come to a halt. But the way the war ends will shape our continent for generations to come. The future of the Ukrainians is at stake, but so is ours. A bad deal could encourage Russia to come back for more. It would be a recipe for more instability and insecurity. Instead, a just and lasting peace could usher in a new era of prosperity for Ukraine and help us build a new security architecture in Europe.
Okay, I'm all about having a just peace and building a new security architecture in Europe. But before I touch on that, but let me back up to something she said a second ago, is that a, quote, bad deal is a recipe for disaster and for more insecurity for Europe. But as I think you and I have discussed before, you can either have a bad deal now, and I don't disagree with that characterization, or you can have a military defeat. It seems to me those are your only options. How do you see it?
Well, the problem that we face, Danny, is that there is no deal that you can come up with that both the Russians and the Ukrainians will embrace. There's just no way of satisfying both parties here. And the end result is that this is going to be settled on the battlefield in all likelihood. I don't see, what the deal is. She did not spell out the deal that she considers to be a good deal that both the Ukrainians and the Russians will accept, unsurprisingly. And if we asked her to spell out the deal and she spelled it out, it would be a deal that the Ukrainians and the Europeans like, but it would be a deal that the Russians would reject out of hand. So where does that leave you? It tells you, I think, and you and I have talked about this many times, that you're going to have to settle this one on the battlefield.
Well, as it turns out, she did go into some discussion of what that means. She mentioned that last thing there, a just and lasting peace. Obviously, that's in the eye of the beholder. But in this particular beholder, here's how her eye defines just and lasting peace.
A just and lasting peace that ensures Ukraine's sovereignty, respects the territorial integrity, and upholds the European aspirations. This is the crossroad we face, and Europe has a huge stake. So we must do our utmost to strengthen Ukraine's hand. Because we've all seen how Russia negotiates. They bomb, they bully, they bury promises beneath rubble. Putin wants to force Ukraine to accept the unacceptable. So the task we face is to help Ukraine stand strong, defy Putin's intimidation, and engage in peace talks based on its own conditions.
Okay, so there's a lot of dramatic contradictions there, but I want to start off first of all with something she said right at the beginning of that her idea of a just and lasting peace is Ukraine with their sovereignty, with all their territorial integrity, and the aspirations of the Europeans all intact. Is that possible?
No, no. I mean, it's obvious that this is what the Ukrainians and the Europeans want and have wanted for months now. It's very clear. She didn't say anything that we didn't know. That's what the Ukrainians again and the Europeans want. It is categorically unacceptable to the Russians. So the question is, where does that leave you? And the answer is very simple. You're going to settle this one on the battlefield.
And then you have the next part there where she says, and just almost like, how dare he? Putin is trying to force Ukraine into a settlement of their choice. I'm like, okay, finally you said something that's accurate, because that's exactly what Russia is trying to do. Do you see it any differently?
No, I agree completely. And this is a problem that the Americans have. They don't seem to fully accept that the Russians have a set of non-negotiable demands. You want to remember that for the Russians, this is an existential war. And this gets back to the conversation we were having a few minutes ago about World War II and World War I. You want to understand that in both World War I and World War II, Russia / the Soviet Union was invaded. In fact, Russia was defeated in World War I. It was knocked out of the war by the Germans. In World War II, the Germans invaded the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. Long before that, Napoleon invaded Russia. There is a rich history of different countries invading Russia. So the Russians are very sensitive about their borders. And the West thinks that it can take NATO and the EU, these two powerful institutions, and run them right up to Russia's borders. And the Russians are not supposed to care. There's no security threat here. This is a foolish way of thinking about how Russia evaluates its threat environment. From a Russian perspective, given Russian history, how can the Russians not be concerned when a military alliance that was a mortal foe of the Soviet Union from 1949 up until when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, not be fearful of that alliance expanding into Ukraine, of all pieces of territory on Russia's border? I mean, it's just hard for me to understand why people in the West don't understand the essence of the problem here. It is so straightforward. And probably a lot of it has to do with the fact that they ignore history. I think if you pay serious attention to history, and if you try to put yourself in the shoes of Russian leaders, it quickly becomes apparent that there can be no NATO membership for Ukraine. It has to be a neutral state, and it can't be a meaningful offensive threat to Russia. The Russians have made this clear time after time after time. And when you listen to Western leaders talk, and this includes President Trump, J.D. Vance, and so forth and so on, it's like they don't get it. And I don't understand why they don't get it. I would imagine that Steve Witkoff, who's had extensive conversations with the Russians and with Putin in particular, has told them full well what the Russian demands are. But it just seems that they can't grasp what those demands are and can't say simply, we are going to accept them or we're not going to accept them. Either you accept these main Russian demands or you don't. And if you don't, the war goes on.
Yeah, and part of the I'll add my frustration onto what you're saying there. If you're talking about the Western leaders in the, let's say, the January 2022 timeframe before the war started, you could argue that all the things that we know have happened would, for the reasons you just mentioned from the historical record, but there was at least be the theoretical possibility. But yeah, but if we hit them just right, if we do this, then maybe that we can end up having them weakened enough, whatever. At least it's theoretically possible. But Professor, we're talking now well into the fourth year of the war, and these comments were made yesterday, and she can't be that naive anymore, can't be that unknowledgeable about the battlefield realities. That's the part I have a hard time understanding, because surely, I hope, these people are smart enough to be able to say, we can use these words here, but we know that the reality and the battlefield disparity on the front lines won't ever allow this to become true. So then one have to ask, then what's the play here?
I think the best argument that you can make in their favor, and here I'm talking about the West Europeans or the Europeans, is that they believe that if they continue holding the line, they can eventually convince the Trump administration to go along with them. In other words, they see that the Trump administration is constantly going back and forth on what kind of concessions to make to the Russians. And some days it does appear like the Trump administration is siding, at least somewhat, with the Europeans and the Ukrainians. And one could argue that this gives people hope that the Americans will eventually get back on board and that Donald Trump will end up acting just like Joe Biden. So they don't want to quit too soon. As long as there's a slight chance that Trump will change his mind, let's just stay in the fight. So I think you could make the case that that's what's going on. But I think this is all futile. The Russians are going to win, even if the Americans get back in the fight. The Russians were winning when the Americans were in the fight under Joe Biden. And Trump has made it unequivocally clear that he's not interested in staying in the fight in any meaningful way. And given the balance of power on the battlefield, that means that the Russians are going to win ultimately. What exactly that victory looks like is hard to say, but they're going to win. And it would make much more sense to cut a deal now. But getting that message across, especially to the Europeans and the Ukrainians, is almost impossible.
Yeah.
And by the way, Danny, I would just add that all of this resistance on the part of the Ukrainians and the part of the Europeans, and by the way, I can understand the Ukrainian resistance. I can understand that. It's their country that is being taken apart. The Europeans, I don't understand. But anyway, one could argue, I think quite persuasively, that the resistance from Europe and the resistance from Ukraine to any sort of meaningful negotiation with the Russians, the lack of any effort to sort of accommodate the Russians and their concerns, tells the Russians that what they have to do is they really have to conquer a lot of territory in Ukraine. And they have to definitely make sure that Ukraine is a dysfunctional rump state that can't join NATO or can't join the EU. So what's happening here is incentivizing the Russians not to cooperate and try to work out a deal with the West, because their belief is surely that you can't do that in any meaningful way, but instead to prevail in a significant way, in a marked way on the battlefield, so that Ukraine is not a meaningful threat anywhere down the road.
Yeah, it's a bit of a preview of I got a show later this afternoon where I'm going to look at some of the things Trump and JD Vance have been saying of late, which I guess kind of gives some plausibility to your theory there that the Europeans are like saying, let's drag this out and maybe change their mind, because you may recall that on I think it was April the 18th, you had Secretary of State Rubio come out on a plane on one of his foreign trips, and he said, we're days away from either walking or coming up with a deal. And then that day has now turned into 20 days. And then he said it a week later that it's, this week will be decisive, and yet nothing happens. There's no deal, and yet we don't walk. And then now we've added a $350 million F-16 package, a $50 million military package, air defense missiles. So we're doing, I guess we're feeding that monster. And here's the damage to it, because now that you see this last piece from Ursula von der Leyen, she gives an answer to how she thinks she can bring her vision of having a just and lasting peace into effect.
Let me start with the military side, the so-called porcupine strategy. Russia is a permanent threat for the whole of Europe, so Ukraine must be strong enough to deter any future attack with deterrence through denial. Europe has already supported Ukraine with 50 billion euros in military aid, but now we must move from a logic of aid to a logic of integration of our defence industries. And this is the central element in our white paper Readiness 2030. We're encouraging our member states to place orders directly in Ukraine's defence industry, because this is the most effective and the most cost-efficient way to support Ukraine's military efforts.
So there you have it, straight out of her mouth. They're trying to drag this out for 3 more years. I'm sorry, for 5 more years. The Project 2030. They want to drag this thing out so that all these defense contracts can be building more weapons and more ammunition, oblivious to the cost on the human beings on the Ukraine front. Is there any possibility that the Ukraine army can survive 5 more years of what they're facing from the Russians?
No, and she doesn't give any specifics. What we need to know are what are the numbers. I want to know from her, what are the balance of forces on the Ukraine-Russia front at this point in time? How many troops do you have on each side? What do the armaments look like on both sides? And then moving forward, what do you think the troop levels will look like? It's quite clear that the Russians are recruiting somewhere between 30 and 40,000 people every month. How many people are the Ukrainians recruiting? And what effect will the ratio of Russian recruits per month to Ukrainian recruits per month mean for the gap that now exists between Russia and Ukraine on the battlefield? What about weaponry? We know the Russians are producing huge amounts of weaponry. Are the Ukrainians and the Europeans together, and maybe the Americans, going to be able to keep up with the Russians? None of these questions are dealt with. She's basically arguing that Ukraine can stay in the fight, and not only stay in the fight, but can rectify the situation on the battlefield, right, roll back Russian gains, and that Ukraine can get its territory back. That's what she's in favor of doing. And she provides no evidence of how that can be done. She makes all these airy-fairy comments about doing X and doing Y and doing Z, but it just doesn't tell you anything. I want to know what the numbers look like. This is a war of attrition. And we know that the Russians have a significant advantage. We know that the Ukrainians are having trouble covering the entire front. They're leaving gaps on the front line because they don't have enough forces to fill all of the front line. The force to space ratio, so to speak, is working against them at this point. How does she plan to rectify that? There's just no answers. And what about air defenses? It's quite clear that the Ukrainians are desperate for better air defenses, and that the Russians are pretty much free to bomb away inside of Ukraine. Is this going to change anytime soon? Does she have any plans for how Ukraine is going to get more air defenses, how it's going to get a better air-to-air capability? Is she going to make the argument that Ukrainian drones are better than Russian drones, which are improving by the day? Maybe there is an argument to be had there, but she doesn't lay it out. It's just empty rhetoric. It sounds like these people are in the Führer bunker. April 19th.
I was thinking of World War II. Right? There's some other analogies that are less attractive from our side. And yeah, that's certainly the case here. And when you look on the front line, in just the last week or so, the pace of acceleration of the Russians has been accelerating somewhat and staying very consistent. Otherwise, there have been days where Russia has taken 20 and 29 square kilometers in a single day, all across the front, added up. So these things are coming in chunks now. There was some more. I looked earlier this morning. There have been some new losses on the eastern front of the Kupiansk area down in the Zaporizhia. There is evidence that Russia is on the other side of the Dnieper River and could open a new front down there, which would be really, really bad for the Ukraine because they don't have many defenses on the other side of that river because they have piecemealed it out, the troops that they had there, thinking that the river was going to protect them. So they have sent those troops elsewhere to defend against other holes in the gaps. And if the Russians do penetrate there on the Dnieper River and cross into that area, the Zaporizhia area, there's almost nothing that can stop. We'll see how that develops. But all these developments that are happening are definitely on the bad side for the Ukraine.
Danny, if I can just make one other point, it's very important to emphasize that it is Ukrainians who are doing the dying here. And it's not Europeans, it's not Germans, it's not Americans. And it's very easy to talk in cavalier ways about continuing the war when it's not your people who are dying on the battlefield. And I think one of the real problems that we face in the West is that the West has gotten away for a long time with either relying on the all-volunteer military, in the United States' case, or relying on others like the Ukrainians to do the dying. The elites basically don't die. They don't put their lives at risk. And I think this has a tendency to make us rather cavalier when it comes to this whole issue of using military force and then continuing losing wars. We'd still be in Afghanistan if Trump hadn't made the decision to get out. It's just quite remarkable how willing we are to engage in these wars and then keep them going. And again, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that Americans don't die, and in this case, Europeans don't die either. If Germans were dying on the battlefield, this war would have been brought to an end a long time ago.
Yeah, I'm sure that's the case. And that same thing is also going on. In fact, I think a lot of those same dynamics are going on elsewhere in the world. I want to shift gears a little bit here in the time we have left with you here to look at two other issues. One is on the issue of Iran. And we could look at a lot of things in the Middle East, but there was some comments that were made by Trump yesterday and today, which kind of bring it up into the current atmosphere. And I want to talk about that. First of all, yesterday, Trump was asking a little bit more detail because he keeps saying that, we're trying to work a deal with Iran. We've had a couple of rounds, maybe 3 rounds in negotiations. So he was asked yesterday, where are we on those negotiations?
I'd much rather make a deal, a really verified deal. We want total verification. We can do that. We have some very brilliant people up at MIT and various other places. We could do that very, very solidly. But I would much prefer a strong verified deal where we actually blow them up, but blow them up or just denuke them. But there are only 2 alternatives there: blow them up nicely or blow them up viciously. And
there's no half measure. That's what I wrote for the Washington Examiner today.
You got to get them out. Can't do it.
Isn't the U.S. position that Iran can have an enrichment program as long as it doesn't reach a weapons?
We haven't made that decision yet. We will, but we haven't made that decision yet.
Okay, so you got some problems here. You had Steve Witkoff 2 or 3 weeks ago initially come back, and he went on Fox News and said, hey, yeah, look, we're working on a deal. After I talked to them, they don't need to reprocess anything more than 3.67%. And then the next day he went back and seemed to backtrack from that and say, well, they don't need to reprocess anything. And then today, Trump has just said, well, I don't really know what we have. If you don't even know what your objectives are on the negotiating side, how are you going to come to an agreement on the other side?
Well, I think Trump knows exactly what he has to do here to get a deal. And he has to basically go back to some form of the JCPOA, the agreement that he walked away from. The real issue on the table here is nuclear enrichment and reprocessing. The Iranians have an enrichment and reprocessing capability, and indeed they're enriching uranium up to 60%. And from an Israeli point of view and from an American point of view, this is unacceptable. What happened with the JCPOA, which was negotiated in 2015, is there were severe limits put on Iran's ability to enrich uranium, but they were allowed to keep their enrichment and reprocessing capability. It's very important to understand that. And that's, I believe, the principal reason that Trump, with support from the Israelis, walked away from the JCPOA in 2018. So the question here is whether Trump is going to backtrack and allow Iran to keep its enrichment and reprocessing capability. That's the issue, and that's the question he was asked. And the fact that he did not give a clear answer tells me that there is a good chance, I don't want to overstate the case here, but there's a good chance that he's going to accept the fact that they keep their enrichment and reprocessing capability.
Well, based on what he said prior to that, it seems like that's his only choice. Either go back to some variation of the JCPOA. And by the way, I've already seen many of his ardent supporters emphatically tell him, don't do that, because you'll be an Obama light, etc. So he's coming under pressure on his side. Or he does what he said in the first part, was, well, we'll either blow it up the easy way or we'll blow it up the hard way. So he seems to have boxed himself into a negotiating position to where either you do something like Obama did in 2015 or you go to war. Do you see any other alternative?
Well, the other alternative is he can just maintain the status quo, which is you don't bomb Iran. And
yeah, but see, he said it's one or the other. So that's a third one that he didn't say. So how would he walk out of that one?
Danny, this guy says something different every day.
All right, good point.
Come on, it would be no problem for him to just change his tune tomorrow.
Well,
and that's why we don't want to put too much stock in what he said today, because it could be the case that after you and I get off the air and we look at what's on the news sites, we discover that he contradicted what we just said or what he said previously. He's just all over the place. But look, I think that he understands that from his point of view and from the Israelis' point of view, we either have to get a deal or we're going to bomb Iran. So I think basically those are the two choices that he sees. And he does not want to bomb Iran. To be blunt, he would be nuts to bomb Iran. It would be a major league air offensive against Iran. And it would have huge consequences in the region and may have huge consequences, all negative, for the international economy. He just doesn't want to do that. So what he'd like to do is work out a deal. You used the phrase JCPOA light. I don't think that's what they are going to push for. I think that they will push for a more sophisticated version of the JCPOA, one that is more demanding of the Iranians. And I think the issue here is the sunset clauses. One of the other problems with the JCPOA, in addition to the fact that it allowed Iran to keep its enrichment and reprocessing capability, is the fact that it had sunset clauses. It was going to run out. I think if the Trump administration can get a long-lasting deal and seriously commit the United States to that deal, you'll get the Iranians to sign on. And even though they will keep their reprocessing and enrichment capability, they won't be able to go down the nuclear weapons road. And we could then live happily ever after. So I think you could fashion a JCPOA agreement that works. But as you pointed out, that will not be easy to sell because the Israelis and all of their acolytes here in the United States will be adamantly opposed to that deal, and they'll, beat Trump over the head for accepting.
Well, as it turns out, there's another challenge to this, and that's the Iranian side. And here's this is back in February, but this is where they have been.
با مذاکره با آمریکا هیچ مشکلی حل نمیشه. دلیل تجربه مذاکره کردیم، امتیاز دادیم، کوتاه آمدیم، اما نتیجه‌ای که مقصودمون بود به دست نیاوردیم. همین معاهده را هم با همه این نقص‌هایی که داشت طرف مقابل باز خراب کرد، نقض کرد، پاره کرد. با یه چنین دولتی مذاکره نباید کرد. مذاکره کردن عاقلانه نیست، هوشمندانه نیست، شرافتمندانه نیست. ما اگر تهدیدمون بکنن تهدیدشون میکنیم. اگر این تهدید رو عملی کنن ما هم تهدید رو عملی میکنیم.
So the Iranians are going, okay, we've watched this movie before. We've seen this guy go back on his deals. Why are we going to negotiate with again? And would you argue with them?
But the fact is, Danny, they are negotiating. Steve Witkoff has had a number of meetings with the foreign minister of Iran. So they are negotiating. And the reason is that Iran would like to put this problem to rest. It would like to take it off the table. So there is, I think, good reason to believe that if you could get a sophisticated version of the JCPOA or a better version of the JCPOA, maybe that's the best way to put it, I think you could get the Iranians on board because I think they have a vested interest in ending all of this trouble over their nuclear capability. So they are negotiating. You may get a deal. But I would note that given how untrustworthy the United States is in general, and especially the Trump administration, I think the problem you really face is convincing the Iranians that if they sign on to this new version of the JCPOA, that we won't walk away from it again.
Right.
I mean,
that
this
is the real
that
problem.
Putin faces as well, right? Can you trust the Americans? I don't think so.
Yeah, that's something we run into all over the place. In the final few minutes we have here, something that, especially if you're international theorist hat, if you can put that on real quick. In this emerging situation here between India and Pakistan, there was just real briefly there was a terrorist attack in the Kashmir area on the Indian side at the latter part of April. 26 people were murdered by Islamic radicals. There was lots of debates and accusations flying back and forth between India and Pakistan. And then a couple of nights ago, there was this big, huge attack by India on 9 different spots inside both Kashmir and inside Pakistan. Pakistan has vowed revenge and retaliation, which so far has not been seen. Although there was some claims this morning that 50 Indian troops had been killed by Pakistan. Still haven't gotten that ironed out. But the big question and the big fear of so many people is you've got 2 nuclear powers here, and can this go up the escalation ladder to eventually turn into something really ugly? And I know you've got a lot to say on the escalation ladder, and I don't know if you could tell us where you think this is heading.
Well, I think that it's, first of all, hard to tell exactly what has happened over the past 2 or 3 days concerning the exchanges between the Pakistanis and the Indians. For example, almost everybody agrees that India did attack Pakistan in retaliation for the terrorist attacks in Kashmir on Wednesday. But the Pakistanis claim that they shot down 5 Indian aircraft. The Indians have not acknowledged that, but it does seem that maybe 2 or 3 Indian aircraft were lost. It also is clear that the Pakistanis are retaliating against the Indians in the sense that they're firing artillery from Pakistan into the Indian-controlled part of Kashmir, and they're inflicting casualties on the Indians in that part of Kashmir. So it's just very hard to sort of get a sense of what the back and forth really looks like. Nevertheless, it's quite clear that both sides are going up the escalation ladder. They have not gone far up the escalation ladder. My view, Danny, is that at the lower and really even at the middle rungs of the escalation ladder, India does not have dominance over Pakistan. It does not have escalation dominance. I think Pakistan has sufficient conventional forces that it can go up pretty far up the escalation ladder and keep up with the Indians. Certainly the Pakistanis won't have escalation dominance, but again, I don't think the Indians will. But once you begin to get near the top of the escalation ladder, the Indians have dominance because the Indians have far superior conventional forces. The problem is the Indians don't want to go to the top of the escalation ladder because you'll probably end up either in a limited or major conventional war involving India invading Pakistan. This is not good for India, certainly not good for Pakistan. And all of the major powers like China, Russia, and the United States don't want this to happen. So I think this one will remain down on the lower rungs of the escalation ladder. And I think it will be clear to both sides that neither one can best the other side. So at some point, they'll stop escalating and declare victory. Now, where that point is very hard to say. I don't think you're going to go too far up the escalation ladder, to be honest. But if you do, if I'm wrong, and you go up the escalation ladder, and you end up with a serious conventional war, even if it's limited, but it's, involves ground forces on both sides in Pakistani territory. There, the risk of nuclear escalation is real. And that's because India is outgunned at the conventional level. It's just very important to understand that once you get up at the top of the escalation ladder and the balance of conventional forces really matters, India is at a great disadvantage, and it has nuclear weapons. And if India invades Pakistan, remember what we're talking about here, Indian troops in Pakistan, that will represent an existential threat to the Pakistanis. And the temptation to use those nuclear weapons by Pakistan will be great because Pakistan is outgunned at the conventional level. Now, this is not to say that Pakistan would axiomatically use nuclear weapons. I don't think you want to go that far, but there's no question they would seriously countenance using nuclear weapons. We do not want that, right?
Yeah, definitely not.
Russians don't want that, and I don't think the Indians want that. So I think
definitely the Chinese don't either. So
yeah, the Chinese, of course, don't want that either. So I don't think we're going to go far up the escalation ladder.
So let me ask you. So we're on rung one, you might can say. India, when they announced their attacks, they said that this was a responsible, non-escalatory, and limited strike, basically saying, okay, we're done. Everything that happened here with the terrorist attack, we're good to go. Pakistan now has said, no, this was an active war and we're going to retaliate. What do you expect? And I caveat the question. India would certainly have expected before they launched their first strike here that they would be prepared for whatever would come next. So they're probably mentally prepared for that. What can Pakistan do to satisfy their side that they have defended their honor, but not go so far as that India then feels the need to continue going up the escalation ladder?
Well, I think if you're the Pakistanis, you want to do something that looks like the equivalent of what India did on Wednesday. And you want to also use rhetoric when you describe what you're doing to make it clear that this is a limited attack. You're going out of your way not to kill civilians, and you're just duplicating what the Indians did. And you, Pakistan, have no interest in further escalation. I mean, if you think about what the Indians did, just listen to the rhetoric that you laid out that the Indians employed. They made it clear they don't want to go up the escalation ladder, right? And they don't. And I think the Pakistanis should do the same thing if and when they retaliate. And hopefully then, the Americans, the Chinese, or the Russians, I don't know who's working the hardest behind the scenes, can convince both sides to declare victory and walk away from the escalation ladder.
Now, this is strikingly similar, at least in some categories, with the 2019 flare-up that happened. There was a terrorist attack on Indian people. Then they attacked some sites in Pakistan. They retaliated, and then that was kind of the end of it. Do you see a similar thing going here? And then second question is this ever going to be solved where this whole Kashmir thing can go away?
Yeah, I would not be surprised if it ends in a way similar to how the 2019 crisis ended, and even the 2016 crisis. In neither case did this spin out of control. But as I've often emphasized, we do not have good theories of escalation in the international relations literature. Escalation is a very difficult subject to get your head around. And that just tells you never can be too confident that escalation won't take place in situations like this. It is a real possibility. But I think if you look at what the incentive structure is on both sides, both the Indian and Pakistan sides, I think a good case can be made, not a great case, but a good case that we won't go far up the escalation ladder. And let's hope that's the case. Now, with regard to your second question, is this problem going to go away? Is there any solution? The answer is no, in large part because military force does not solve the problem. As we both know, Danny, many people in the West think that military force is like a magic wand. If you get into trouble, you just turn the military loose and the military can solve the problem. That happens occasionally, not very often.
Not very often.
Most of these problems are political problems. Remember Clausewitz's famous dictum: war is an extension of politics by other means. You just want to think about that. War is an extension of politics. So the problem in Kashmir is essentially a political problem. It's a question of who controls Kashmir. Is it Pakistan or is it India? Or should Kashmir be an independent state? This political issue has never been solved. And because the political issue has never been solved, we have this ongoing conflict. And it is going to be an ongoing conflict until you get a political solution. And using military force is not going to solve the problem. And what the Pakistanis are doing in turning to terrorism, or what these terrorists are doing, is they are the weaker side. India, as I said before, is conventionally more powerful than Pakistan is. And given that imbalance, it's unsurprising that Pakistan and these terrorist groups turn to terrorism as a weapon of fighting against India. So I think even if this is settled, and hopefully it will be in the next couple of days, I think we can expect another terrorist attack somewhere in the future.
It just kind of gets the feeling that it's like a volcano that periodically will erupt and then go back down. And you just hope it doesn't turn into Mount Vesuvius. I think that's where this is going to be.
I think that's a good way of putting it.
Well, listen, we really appreciate you coming back on today. Always a treasure to have you on. And remind anybody that if you can't get enough of John Mearsheimer, go to his Substack address there. I think Gary's got it up there. You can always, see they got there right there, India and Pakistan on the brink. And you can talk about that and everything that comes up. You see, you got stuff coming up all the time. So we really appreciate that, and send people there if they want more.
Thank you, Danny, for having me on. I appreciate it greatly.
Always a pleasure. And we thank you guys. And also to let you know that you got a show coming up this afternoon. We're going to take a little bit more detailed look at what President Trump and Vice President Vance have been saying about this whole Russia-Ukraine war, and, well, some surprising things there you're not going to want to miss. See you this afternoon on Daniel Davis Deep Dive. We'll see you then.